Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time you happen to be watching this, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going through the fourth presentation on Ordinary Grace. We're going to try to make sure that we cover everything we need uh, to help you guys write the paper and to kind of get ready to wrap up the idea of analysis and critical evaluation that this course is supposed to be about. As we take a look at Ordinary Grace, I think the first thing we're going to do is define criticism and analysis. For the paper, I'm asking that people critically judge. You're commenting on the qualities and character of the literary works. You are, to use the Nick Shabazz thing that we've used several times, the good, the great, the bad, the ugly, and the how and the why of all of this. So when you're doing analysis, you're carefully examining and evaluating the details of the text. You're breaking it down into all of its components. And then once you've broken it down, and we've already talked about which parts specifically each of you have to break down, then you're going to comment on the qualities. How well did Kruger do everything? As I go through this presentation, it's going to be more of the same. I want to build on the coming of age elements. I want to talk about the characterization. And we're going to stick with Ruth, Nathan, Gus, and Ariel. I want to talk about a new connection. And that connection, I hope, will tie into the context to some degree. And then I want to build on the analysis of foreshadowing, something you're not going to write about, but think about his use of weather and the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of how Kruger builds suspense in this novel. We talked about Morris being particularly stupid in the previous presentation. Now we find that his cowardice is greater than his stupidity. And for me, there is this idea that perhaps he is a malicious version of Eddie Haskell. You guys are all way too young to remember Leave It to Beaver in glorious black and white television. But Eddie Haskell was not the bully necessarily, but he was a sort of smarmy character from that TV show. Um, he was always complimenting uh, the character Beaver's mother. He was always just being a little bit snarky and always providing a sense of trouble. He was never malicious, but he was self serving. As I keep going here, you'll notice the word sycophants, which is a fancy way of saying suck up, and he is being overly, extremely polite. He had a shallow and sneaky character. Um, he was conniving or picking on the character Beaver. All of those things are things that, in some ways, lead us to Morris, except Morris is mean. I think that's fair. He is a bully. I'm not quite sure that Eddie rose to that level, but there is a certain sneakiness to Morris and I think it might be a connection worth looking about. And in context of the early 1960s, I do wonder whether Kruger wanted people of my age to be thinking about that. Let's move on to characterization. Remember in one of the earlier presentations, we talked about Ariel being the light of her mother's life. That continues here. She's going to do more with her talent than I ever did with mine. And the mom is trying, whenever Ariel wants to step out of the path that mom has selected for her, Ruth tries very hard to get her back on line. The idea that You're so young. You have so much to learn. But if you learn it, you will do more with your talent than I ever did with mine. But we see Ariel building on the I can sneak out, building on the suspicions that Frankie has that she's sleeping with her boyfriend. And we have her dropping the F bomb, talking about the performance, the thing that her mother is living for. And so there's this conflict between Ariel and Ruth, but there's a conflict between our perceptions that Frankie has given us and the reality that's a little bit more hardcore. Then we have this moment where we sort of get a mix of the old man telling us the story from a distance and the kid who's in the moment. And again, remember, point of view matters. Remember that Frank, as an adult, is telling us this story from when he was 13. And this memory of what he was thinking at this moment when Ariel had this big smile and he thought she was the most special person on earth and that she was destined for greatness is sort of the last moment of innocence in this novel. The last moment of everything being perfect, of Frank being a kid, of the family being that perfect sort of family. One of the things that Kruger, I think, does is he kind of sometimes hits us over the head with this idea that something bad is coming. And I think a lot of authors do that. We talked about the drums in one of the previous novels, and the idea that once you hear those drums, bad stuff is going to happen. The next morning, I woke to the threat of rain. Notice the word threat. You know, it could be the promise of rain. I mean, after all, if you're going to grow crops, you need rain, and this was an agricultural area. The sky, the gray had deepened, probably, fairly neutral. But when the clouds begin to boil, we're not thinking about a normal rainstorm. We're thinking about something rather nasty. So we have threats, we have clouds beginning to boil. There's no doubt, or there should be no doubt as you're reading, that bad crap is going to happen. And because of words like threat and the clouds begin to boil, I do wonder, based on this presentation and the last presentation, whether Kruger is doing way too much to beat the crap out of this idea of foreshadowing, to the concept of foreshadowing, if he's just overdoing it. Frank is growing up. He has to make adult decisions about letting Warren Redstone escape, even though he had Ariel's necklace. He has to deal with the fact that he was the one who finds Ariel's body. He has to deal with the fact that there was always a question of what happened to her. And now that he knows, he has to deal with the fact that there's no hope left. When they didn't know, there was always hope that she would come back. Now he knows she's not. And to go a little bit further, he finds out that this death is not accidental. He finds out that what he had hoped or believed was that there was no way that there was anything bad happening. Now we find out that death was not accidental. We find out that she has been killed. I'll be a little bit picky here and say that we don't know if it was premeditated, so we can't really know at this moment whether it's murder which has the word presentation, but certainly somebody killed her. We find Ruth being totally and completely crushed, and we find Ruth going deeper into her Ayn Rand, I'm going to reject Christianity. She communicates her fear through silence and random moments. She's smoking. She's letting the cigarette just burn down to the end where it's probably going to burn her fingers. The ashes are likely dropping where they're going to light the house on fire, or at least the couch. And then, as Nathan tries to do what he wants, what he's trained to do as a minister, she is rejecting that. She is rejecting the Bible. She is rejecting his calling, and she is rejecting him as much as she's rejecting the Bible and the help he's offering. And we find Nathan, who was described as a handsome man, who was described as somebody who seemed to have everything in control, becoming someone unrecognizable. And we have a build on what we talked about previously, the post-traumatic stress, the mention that Gus made about you killed them all. You have the thing about Nathan cracked during the war that Doyle talked about. And he is taking all of the blame as if this is punishment for things that happened during the war. And in a lot of ways, this is his sense of doubt. A person who seems to have lived by faith throughout this whole thing seems to now have a sense of doubt. And so when we're looking at this novel with Grace, we see that he is questioning Grace. Ruth is questioning Grace. Frank is probably too young to wonder about it, but we're starting to question that sense of grace as in God's favor and sanctification and things like that. And so that becomes a chunk of the novel that we have to be looking at where the title starts coming into play. Gus now all of a sudden becomes the lone adult in the novel. He's this constant but quiet presence. He is trying to help Frank deal with everything. He's trying to get him out of the sun. He's trying to, get some diversion in his life, the mug of root beer, the ride on the motorcycle. And he's trying to restore Nathan's faith a little bit. He's trying to get Nathan to think about the good of his faith, the grace that comes with that faith. I know I give you a hard time about your religion, but damned if I'm not grateful at heart that you believe it. The idea that Nathan's faith is a bit of grace in Gus's life is something that Nathan can build on. And Gus now is becoming the adult. He is becoming someone who is holding the family and holding people's faith together, or at least urging the family and urging the faith to stick, or urging people to stick to the faith. Excuse me for that bad phrasing. I think we're going to wrap this one up here. I hope everybody's having a good day, and I hope to see you all in class the next class period.